It was a quiet April morning in Kigali. The sun was just beginning to rise over the hills, casting a soft orange glow across the city. People were waking up, children were laughing, radios were playing, and then everything changed. At 8:23 p.m. the night before, April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwanda's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down as it approached the airport. The wreckage lit up the sky, and within 2 hours, the gates of hell opened. Rwanda, a small landlocked nation of beautiful hills and valleys, became the stage for one of the fastest and most brutal genocides in human history. Over the next 100 days, more than 800,000 people, men, women and children, were wiped away. Not by bombs, not by drones, but by their own neighbors, classmates and even friends. The year 1994 became known as the bloodiest year in Africa. To understand what happened, we must go back before the machetes, before the screams. Rwanda's tragedy didn't begin in 1994. It was planted decades before, during colonial rule. When the Belgians took control after World War I, they divided the Rwandan people into two ethnic groups, the Hutus and Tutsis. But this wasn't a natural divide. It was man-made. The Belgians favored the Tutsis, seeing them as more noble because of their height and lighter skin, while the Hutus were branded inferior. They issued identity cards marking everyone as Hutu or Tutsi, a simple piece of paper that would one day become a death sentence. Over time, resentment built. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, power shifted to the Hutus. But instead of unity, old wounds deepened. Discrimination, revenge and fear became everyday politics. And by the 1990s, that fear had fermented into something deadly. President Habyarimana had ruled for 21 years, a man many saw as both a leader and a divider. By 1990, a rebel group called Rwanda Patriotic Front, the RPF, made up mostly of Tutsi exiles led by Paul Kagame, launched an invasion from Uganda. It was the beginning of a civil war. As peace talks dragged on, hate propaganda flooded the airwaves. A radio station called RTLM became the voice of hatred. It didn't just spread rumors, it named people to be wiped away. It called Tutsis cockroaches that needed to be crushed.
Dimanche 19 juin 1994 et il est 16h22 à Kigali dans le blindé de la RTLM. Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
One journalist later said, words became dangerous as bullets. So, when Habyarimana's plane went down that April night, the message was clear. The time had come for the crushing. Within hours, roadblocks appeared across Kigali. Militias known as Interahamwe's and extremist Hutu leaders began hunting Tutsis. At first, the world thought it was chaos, a civil war, maybe riots, but it wasn't. This was planned. Every name, every address already known. Neighbors turned to neighbors. Husbands killed their wives. Priests betrayed the people hiding in churches. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Streets ran red. Entire families were wiped away in minutes. A survivor later said, "You could hear the killers outside chanting, 'The work is not yet finished,' and I realized the work they meant was us. Churches, once places of refuge, became slaughterhouses. In one of the darkest scenes, over 5,000 men, women, and children were massacred inside the church at Nyarubuye. Some were hacked with machetes, others burned. The church still stands to this day, a silent monument of horror. The Kagera River, which flows north to Uganda, became choked with bodies. Locals called it the river that carried our people away. As the dastard act raged, the world watched and did nothing. The United Nations already had peacekeepers on the ground, led by General Romeo Dallaire from Canada. He had warned his superiors weeks before that something terrible was coming. He even requested permission to seize weapons and arrest militia leaders. The UN refused. When the madness began, they cut the peacekeeping force from 2,500 soldiers to just 270. Dallaire will later say, "I know there is a God, because in Rwanda I shook hands with the devil." Western nations evacuated their citizens, but not the Rwandans. The world labeled it tribal conflict, avoiding the word genocide for weeks, because calling it genocide would have required action. By the time the global community reacted, the killing had already consumed the nation. Meanwhile, Paul Kagame and the RPF were advancing town by town, hill by hill. They fought their way toward Kigali. They weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to stop the genocide. By July 1994, the RPF took control of the capital and declared victory. But there was no celebration, only silence. A silence so heavy that even the air seemed to mourn. The genocide had ended, but the country was destroyed. More than 800,000 lives were wiped out. 2 million refugees, an entire nation was traumatized. Kagame would later say, "The genocide was the failure of humanity itself. Rwanda was left to die, but we refused to stay dead." Rwanda wasn't alone in those 100 days. In Burundi, just months earlier, their first democratically elected president, Melchior Ndadaye, was assassinated, triggering a civil war that took away over 300 lives. In Sudan, the civil war between the North and the South was already raging, still at the same time, with entire nations burnt down and millions displaced. Across Africa, 1994 became the year when blood soaked the soil, when the eyes of God turned away, a reminder that the ghosts of division and hate were still alive. When the guns went silent, Rwanda began an impossible journey to forgive, to rebuild, to heal. Mass graves were uncovered. Families searched for loved ones who would never return. The new government, led by Kagame, faced a question no nation should ever face. How do you live with your killers? Rwanda built a system of local courts called Gakaka, where victims and perpetrators faced each other in open confession. Some cried, some lied, some forgave. The world expected revenge, but what Rwanda gave was reconciliation. Today, the country stands as one of Africa's safest and cleanest nations. Kigali, once soaked in the blood of its own people, is now a city of light and order, thanks to Paul Kagame. Beneath everything else lies memory. Every Rwandan over 30 carries the shadows of 1994, a year that remains the bloodiest in Africa's history, a year when humanity failed not once but many times, when the world's silence became as deadly as the machetes that cut through the night. General Dallaire said it best: "We watched people dying, not because we couldn't stop it, but because we chose not to. The lessons of 1994 are not distant history. They live on in the politics of division, in the language of hate, in the silence of indifference. Because genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with words, with fear, with us versus them. And that's why Africa must remember, not just to mourn the dead, but to protect the living. If you ever walk the hills of Rwanda, you will find memorials, quiet, beautiful and haunting. You'll see the skulls, the clothes, the names carved in stones. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them whisper, never again. But history has a way of testing our promises, because never again must be more than words. It must be a way of life.